The night was heavy with silence, the kind that makes the air feel thick, like something unseen is listening. Eleanor's eyes shot open, her tiny chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The room was cold, too cold. The glow of the nightlight barely reached the corners of the room, and yet the shadows on the wallpaper seemed to move, not from the wind, not from the flickering candlelight. They shifted, as if something was hiding inside them, pressing against the walls, waiting. At the foot of the bed, a black cat sat motionless, its fur darker than the night itself. It was watching her, not in the way a pet watches its owner, but the way a hunter watches its prey. Eleanor clutched her blanket, her little fingers turning white. She didn't remember owning a cat. Then, the door, slowly, ever so slowly, it creaked open. The hallway beyond was empty. No footsteps, no breathing, no one. But the voice came anyway. A whisper, soft and crawling. Eleanor, she froze. He's waiting for you. Her lips trembled. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, in the walls. The room plunged into silence. Eleanor whimpered, curling into herself, pressing against the headboard. And then, a hand, pale, bony, too long to be human, slid out from under the bed. It moved fast, too fast. Thin, skeletal fingers wrapped around her ankle. The cat didn't move. It only watched. Eleanor screamed. The grip tightened. She was dragged down, the darkness swallowing her whole. The Wendell family arrived at Blackthorn Manor on a cool autumn afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the sky sat heavy with gray clouds, and the wind carried a bite, whispering through the trees like it had something to say. James Wendell, the father, was the first to step out of the car. He stood tall, his eyes locked onto the house in front of them, a glimmer of fascination behind his glasses. To him, this was a treasure, a piece of history waiting to be restored. Claire Wendell wasn't so sure. She stood by the car, one hand gripping her daughter Eleanor's shoulder, the other holding her son Theo's hand a little too tightly. She didn't know why, but the sight of the house made her stomach turn. It was beautiful, in the way that old things often are. Ornate carvings on the doors, grand windows that stretched up to the second floor, a towering frame that once held wealth and power. But it was wrong too. The paint had faded, the windows were clouded with dust, and the whole house seemed to lean forward, as if it had been waiting for them. Then, there was Baxter, their old Labrador, a dog who had spent his life chasing squirrels and rolling in the grass, suddenly refused to move. He sat at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house, with his ears pinned back, his body stiff as stone. When James called him, the dog let out a low, warning growl, the kind Claire had never heard from him before. Something in the foyer made him afraid. James laughed it off. "Come on, boy. It's just a house." But Baxter didn't move. He didn't even blink. Claire felt it too. A heaviness in the air, like something unseen was standing just inside the doorway, waiting. And then the housekeeper spoke. She had been watching from the porch, her body hunched beneath a thick shawl. Her voice came out like brittle leaves in the wind. No child should sleep in this house. Claire turned, her throat tightening. They never wake up the same. A gust of wind howled through the trees, rattling the old iron gate behind them. James forced a smile, clearing his throat. Well, that's a comforting welcome. But Claire couldn't move. Not yet. She looked down at Eleanor. The little girl was staring up at the house, her lips slightly parted, her face pale. "Mama." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think someone's already inside." The first night in Blackthorn Manor was quiet, almost too quiet. No sirens, no cars passing, just the sound of the wind pushing against the windows, like it wanted to get inside. At first, everything seemed normal. James and Claire unpacked, the kids explored. Even Baxter, despite his unease, curled up by the fireplace, watching the shadows stretch across the wooden floors. But then, as the days passed, the house changed. Eleanor was the first to notice. She started talking to someone at night. Claire would hear her voice drifting down the hallway, soft, almost playful. But when she peeked inside, Eleanor would be sitting alone on her bed, giggling. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Eleanor looked up, her blue eyes wide. "Mr. Grin." Claire froze. "Mr. Grin," Eleanor nodded. "He's funny. He likes to hide in the walls." Claire's skin crawled. She wanted to brush it off as imaginary. Kids make things up all the time. But the way Eleanor looked at the wall, as if she was waiting for a response, that wasn't normal. And then there was Theo. Theo had always loved to draw, but his drawings changed. Gone were the spaceships and superheroes. Instead, his sketchbook filled with faces, hollow-eyed figures pressed into the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. One night, Claire found him hunched over his desk, furiously scribbling in the dark. "Sweetheart, it's late. You should be sleeping." Theo didn't turn. "He watches me, Mom." His voice was flat, distant. Claire's stomach twisted. "Who does?" Theo's hand tightened around the pencil. "Mr. Grin." The next morning, things got worse. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, rubbing at her arms. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Scratches, long, thin, angry red scratches trailing down her pale skin. "Baby, what happened to your arms?" Eleanor blinked up at her, confused. It was just a game. He said if I stay still, it won't hurt as much. Claire felt her blood run cold. She grabbed Eleanor's wrists, inspecting the marks. They weren't from her nails. They were too sharp, too precise. James waved it off. She probably scratched herself in her sleep. You know how kids are. Claire wasn't so sure. Later that night, she went into Eleanor's closet to grab pajamas. That's when she saw it. A porcelain doll, perfect white skin, dark, glassy eyes, a tiny painted smile. But Claire never bought Eleanor a doll. And worse, the next night the smile was gone. The painted lips had curled downward, as if the doll was frowning. Claire shoved it into a box, locking it in the attic. She didn't care if it was her imagination. She didn't want it near her daughter. But the house wasn't done with them yet, because that same night, Theo disappeared from his bed. Claire woke with a start, her heart hammering. Something felt off. The air was too still. She checked Eleanor's room. Her daughter was sleeping soundly, but Theo's bed, empty. Panic coiled in her chest. She hurried downstairs, and that's when she saw him. Theo, standing in the middle of the kitchen, motionless. The refrigerator's dim light barely touched his face. His eyes were open, but he wasn't awake. Claire reached for him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart." Theo tilted his head, and then he spoke. "He is under the house." A pause. Listening. The lights flickered, and for the first time since moving in, Claire felt truly afraid. By the time James finally admitted that something was wrong, Claire had already stopped sleeping. The scratches on Eleanor's arms were getting worse. Theo barely spoke. The house felt heavier, like it was breathing, shifting, waiting. And then there was Baxter. The dog had been on edge since they moved in, always watching the corners of the room, his ears pinned back, a low whine rattling in his throat. Until one night, he vanished. His bed was empty. His leash still hung by the door. But Baxter, gone. James searched the house, the yard, the woods behind the property. Nothing. They only found his collar, lying in the middle of the basement floor, and it was wet. Something thick, black. Claire refused to stay another night, but James had one last idea. He called in the professionals. Dr. Evelyn Marks and Michael Graves arrived the next evening. They had seen a lot of strange things in their years of paranormal investigation, but nothing quite like the Blackthorn Manor. Michael stepped through the doorway first, sweeping his EMF detector through the foyer. The needles spiked immediately. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "There's something here." James gave a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, no kidding." They set up cameras, thermal, motion sensors, infrared. Every corner of the house watched. And then the real test began. Night one, the lights were off. The house hummed with an eerie stillness. Evelyn sat in the living room, an EVP recorder in her hands. "If there's anyone here with us, can you tell us your name?" Silence. A soft static crackled through the speaker. Then, a whisper. "The children." Claire gripped James's arm. Evelyn kept her voice steady. "What do you want?" More static. And then clear as day. "They are ours now." Claire felt her stomach drop. James rubbed his face, trying to push away the chill creeping up his spine. Evelyn and Michael exchanged a look. They checked the thermal cameras. That's when they saw it. A figure, small, child-sized, standing right next to Eleanor's bed. Claire ran, flew up the stairs. Eleanor was still asleep, curled under the blankets. Alone, but the thermal screen still showed something standing there. Michael swallowed hard. Evelyn exhaled. "It knows we're watching." Hours passed. The house felt different, charged. Michael took a break in the upstairs bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked up. His reflection stared back at him. For a moment he just stood there, breathing. And then the reflection blinked. But he hadn't. Michael's breath hitched. He took a step back. The reflection didn't. Instead, it smiled. Slow, unnatural. Michael's chest tightened. He spun around. No one there. He turned back to the mirror. The reflection was still grinning. A loud crash echoed through the house. Eleanor screamed. Michael ran, his heart pounding. Because whatever was in this house was done playing games. By now, no one in the house was sleeping. Eleanor had stopped talking, even to Mr. Grin. Theo wouldn't leave his room, muttering about eyes in the walls. And Claire kept waking up in the middle of the night with a single thought pounding in her head. There is something beneath this house. Evelyn and Michael knew it too. So they went back to the beginning. The blueprints. Michael spread them out on the dining room table, his flashlight casting a yellow glow over the faded ink. Evelyn ran her finger along the layout, the bedrooms, the attic, the old servant quarters. Then she stopped. There, beneath the house, was a room that shouldn't exist, walled off, hidden. Claire stared at it. "What is that?" Evelyn exchanged a look with Michael. A nursery. The basement was colder than before, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. James held the crowbar, his knuckles white. "You sure about this?" he asked. Michael flicked on the camera. "We need to know." James nodded, then swung. The first hit sent a crack through the air. The second tore through the plaster. By the third, the wall split open like paper, and behind it, a room untouched, frozen in time. A tiny Victorian bedroom. Faded floral wallpaper curled at the edges. A rocking chair sat still in the corner. The air was thick with dust, and something else, something rotten. And in the center of the room, a crib. Claire didn't want to move. She didn't want to see, but her feet carried her forward. She peered inside. Her breath hitched. Wrapped in lace, small and fragile as a doll, lay skeletal remains. Claire covered her mouth, the air too thick to breathe. Michael swallowed hard, aiming the camera at the tiny bones. Jesus Christ! Evelyn knelt beside the crib, her gloved fingers brushing over a dusty leather book. A diary. She opened it. The pages crumbled at the edges, but the words inside were clear. Mr. Blackthorne wanted a son. Claire's stomach turned. The others. The candlelight flickered. He left for the shadows to take. A soft creak echoed from the rocking chair. The shadows feed on them. James stepped back. But they are still here. Then, a whisper. So small. So close. "Why did you wake us up?" The crib shook violently. The lace ripped. The tiny bones shifted. Claire screamed. The walls trembled, the air screeching with unseen voices. Michael grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We need to go. Now." But before they could run, the rocking chair moved. Slowly. Back and forth. Claire looked down at the crib one last time, and this time, the bones were gone. Something was wrong with Eleanor. She barely spoke during the day. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't look anyone in the eye. But at night, she changed. Claire woke to the sound of whispering, low and wrong, curling through the air like smoke. She pushed open Eleanor's door and froze. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, staring straight at her. Her lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. "Mama," Claire shuddered. That voice, too deep, too broken, like 100 voices speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here." Claire stepped closer. "Sweetheart, it's me. It's Mama." Eleanor's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "No." Her eyes gleamed in the dark. "You are trespassers." Theo had been missing for hours. They searched the bedrooms, the basement, the yard. Then Evelyn stopped. Her gaze lifted. The attic. Claire's heart nearly burst out of her chest. The attic door was open. She ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. And there he was, Theo, on his hands and knees, clawing at the wooden floorboards. "Theo, stop." But he didn't. His nails split, fingertips smearing red, but he kept digging. "They're still under here." His voice was flat, hollow. Claire grabbed him, pulling him back. Who is under here?" Theo blinked slowly. "The others." The walls groaned, the air shifting with something unseen. Waiting, Michael stepped forward, his hand shaking as he lifted the lantern. And then, they saw it. An old painting tucked against the attic wall, dust-covered, faded, but the name at the bottom was still clear. Nathaniel Blackthorne. And his face. His eyes had been scratched out. Evelyn's hands trembled as she wiped the dust away, revealing more portraits behind it. All the same, Nathaniel Blackthorne, his face untouched, but the eyes, always missing. Evelyn's breath hitched. He didn't want them watching. Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn didn't answer. She turned to the bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound tome, the edges curling from age. The pages inside were covered in symbols. Blood-red ink, ritual markings, names, so many names. And then, in elegant black script, the words, "The hollow man takes what is owed." Evelyn swallowed hard. Nathaniel wasn't just an industrialist. He was... Claire cut her off, her voice barely above a whisper. "A murderer." Evelyn nodded. He gave them to something, a spirit, a god, something that needed to feed. James ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "That's insane." Evelyn turned the page. Every generation, a child must be given to him. The air grew thick. Claire's stomach turned. "Or the house will take one itself." A loud crash shook the house. The air rushed inward, pulling the warmth from the room. Then, the fireplace erupted. Flames surged black as ink, stretching toward the ceiling. And in the fire, a face, blackened, grinning, the mouth stretched too wide, curling into something that wasn't human. Its eyes, hollow pits, bleeding shadows. It crawled out, not stepping, not walking, crawling. The floor shook beneath them. Claire couldn't breathe. The hollow man had come to collect. The Wendells never looked back. They left Blackthorn Manor before the sun even rose, stuffing their bags into the car with shaking hands. James didn't argue. Claire didn't pack neatly. They just left. The house watched them go. Eleanor slept the whole way home. By the time they reached their new place, a small, bright house miles away from Blackthorn, things felt better. Claire let herself believe it was over. She shouldn't have. Months passed. The nightmares stopped. The whispers faded. But something felt off. Claire noticed it first. Eleanor's voice had changed. Not much. Just enough. A little deeper. A little wrong. When she spoke, there was a flatness to it. A lack of warmth. Claire told herself she was imagining things. Until she saw it. Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, her head tilted, staring at her own reflection. Not blinking, not moving, just watching. Claire's heart pounded. "Sweetheart," she called softly. Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't even flinch, just stood there, smiling. One night, Claire woke with a start. The air was too still. Something was wrong. She slipped out of bed, padding barefoot down the hall. The door to Theo's room was open, and inside, Eleanor, standing over his bed, her mouth stretched too wide, the corners curling up into something that wasn't a smile at all. Claire couldn't breathe. Theo's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at Eleanor. Then, without blinking, he whispered, "Eleanor died in the house, didn't she?" Claire felt the floor drop from beneath her. No, that wasn't true. They saved her. They got her out, didn't they? Her hands shook as she ran to the closet, yanking down old photo albums, flipping through the pages. Theo's first birthday, James and Claire's wedding, trips to the lake. But in every single one, Eleanor was missing. She had never been there. Claire's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Her hands trembled as she dropped the album. Then she ran back to Eleanor's room. But she wasn't there. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. The nursery. She knew where she had to go. The house was empty. The crib sat in the center of the room, just as they had left it. But this time, it was empty. The bones were gone. Claire staggered back. Her breath hitched. In the corner of the room, porcelain doll, small, dressed in lace. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light. Its grin was too wide, identical to Eleanor's. And then, a whisper, soft, crawling. "We always take one." A real estate agent tours the now vacant house. She smiles at a young couple saying, "Oh, don't mind the stories. It's just an old house." As she turns, the black cat from the beginning watches from the stairwell, its eyes glowing.